Welcome everyone back to our National Planning Improvements work under the National Planning Hub in relation to environmental impact assessment, and this is part of our wider training and capacity building programme. So today's is the fourth in our series of online learning events, and today we're going to be focused on environmental impact assessment scoping. And this is very much, we're into the assessment. If you listen to the last one, we were on screening, which was, is EIA required? Once we're at scoping, we know an EIA is required. And really what we're doing here is establishing the basis for the assessment that the developer and their consultants are going to do in order to lead to the EIA report. And then, of course, as a planning authority and planning officers, you'll be dealing with that. But we're very much looking at this kind of front end of the process and how do we make it both effective and efficient. So for those of you who have been on the course before, I remain Josh Fothergill. For those of you who are new to the course, welcome. Very pleased to have you joining us. Do feel free to go back and listen to the previous recordings. I'm Josh Fothergill. I'm the founder and director of Fothergill Training and Consulting Limited, and I've been contracted by the Scottish Government and the Improvement Service to undertake and lead the EIA work under the National Planning Hub, and working with Brodie's, the legal firm, and Neil Collar, who you will have seen on the second webinar and who will also return on the 7th webinar, which will be on the 26th of March. Today, well, just a little bit about myself. I've been in EIA for well over 20 years. I suppose in relation to EIA scoping and that type of thing, I led the Institute for Environmental Management and Assessment, as it was at the time, IEMA's proportionate EIA strategy, that organisation now called ICEP. But a lot of scoping is about trying to focus the assessment. So it shouldn't be everything in the kitchen sink. It should be, how are we going to focus in on significant effects? And I've done a lot of work around this over the years. In fact, I think around 2008, 2009, developed a kind of whole day screening and scoping training course, and also courses on how to establish kind of proportionate EIA and EIA reports. So hopefully I can bring some of that experience to it today. We're just in the welcome and kind of setting the agenda, a little bit about the programme, so I'll talk to you about that in a moment. And then from 10:35 we'll be cracking on with the main event, and then probably around 11:20 we'll be getting on to a live Q&A. So any questions that come up as we go along, feel free to ask those, equally, if questions occur to you at the end, you can fire those in. I'll explain how you do that just after introducing the hub. So the National Planning Hub, it's based in and led by the Scottish Government, and that's in partnership with the Improvement Service. And the hub has effectively been tasked with kind of providing direct support to you guys as planning authorities to help you accelerate decision making. And one of the challenge areas that was identified was, kind of judgments around significance for environmental issues and the environmental impact assessment EIA process. So you can see the link there, planninghub.scot, which will take you to the Planning Hub, and then it will be a page slightly bigger than this, but on the right-hand side, you'll see these various titles. And now under environmental impact assessment, we've got a number of subsections. So we've got an introduction, we have a section on screening that has some supplementary resources alongside the recording of the webinar from late January. The introduction has the two presentations from December in it, and there is a coming soon page on scoping, which will have this recording from today and a number of additional resources that are being developed. So do please keep visiting the hub, because that is very useful to kind of keep up to date with the course and the materials. And if there are people who've missed but want to, within your colleagues, get up to date, then they can go there and catch up. Just some very brief housekeeping before we fully get started. Your microphones and cameras have been disabled for the session. Be aware we are recording it, obviously, as I've mentioned, so it can be put on the hub, but we will exclude that Q&A session, that live Q&A session that we do at the end from the recording, so feel free to ask questions without worry. It should just be planning officers on this, so we're in a kind of safe space. If you want to ask questions, please use the Q&A function, so it's the logo that looks like this, Q&A, rather than the chat. So that's where post your questions. You can do that as we go along, or you can do that at the end, and Andy Watts, who is within the improvement service and effectively is my boss and helping lead the National Planning Hub and the capacity building work. He'll come in and ask those questions. If you have any technical issues, then use the chat for that. So if you're struggling to hear me or see the slides or something like that, please use the chat for that one, but the Q&A for questions would be great. Okay, well, that's all the housekeeping sorted. So let's crack on to the main event, EIA scoping, where they're establishing the basis for an effective and efficient environmental impact assessment process. Our objectives for today in terms of your learning, give you guys as planning officers an understanding of the role that scoping plays and how what might be seen as a stage, certainly from hopefully by the end of today you realise it's more of a process, but how this component of the EIA overall process is crucial for delivering a more proportionate, more focused, more helpful EIA report from the developers, which then obviously have efficiencies for yourselves, for the consenting process, for the consultees. We're going to build your understanding of your duties and effective practices in terms of producing a scoping opinion following a developer's scoping request, and we'll explain what those are if those aren't terms familiar for you. And then we'll also go into how the scoping process links to, I suppose, wider assessment activities that the developer's consultants are going to be undertaking. So all of this is shaping what the developer is going to submit alongside their application, this EIA report, but it isn't you doing work for the developer, it is all about kind of coming together and understanding what are the environmental issues that are going to be most pertinent and where do we need to gather evidence and information so that when the application comes in, we can hopefully just deal with it as that application and not have to make later supplementary information requests. And of course, along the way, as usual, we'll highlight guidance and give you some hints and tips on effective practice. So just very quickly to kind of refresh us, get us back in the EIA space in our brains, environmental impact assessment is a decision support tool, so it's not going to tell you what the outcome of the consent decision should be, but it's there to support the decision and provide environmental information. It's happening before we're determining the planning permission, hence, in the pre-application stages and alongside once the application has been submitted. An EIA focuses and is applied to those projects that are likely to have significant effects on the environment. So it's not something that's going to be there for every project that is coming forward. It is a legislative requirement. The ones that we focus on in this series are the Town and Country Planning Environmental Impact Assessment Scotland regulations from 2017, but there are other regulations, and in fact, our 6th webinar in the series this time next month on the 12th of March will explore some of those and how planning officers can end up linked into some of those systems. And it does inevitably apply a kind of more rigorous approach to the consideration of environmental issues for projects that undergo EIA versus those that go through a standard application process. But that's not to say if they go through a standard application process, environmental issues aren't important. They obviously are, and they still can remain material. But here we're focusing on where we're in the EIA process. So in terms of that process, well, you've got this on your screen, and if you go onto the introduction section of the National Planning Hub web pages, you can download this. You can also interact with it in a different version to find the regulatory references in relation to it. For today, in terms of our EIA process, last time we covered screening and getting into the EIA process as we go around the blue arrows. For today, we're focusing particularly on scoping, focusing the assessment and keeping it proportionate, but inevitably that leads to us talking about some of these further areas. So we will, towards the end of today's session, talk more about, what does the developer do after we've scoped in terms of their assessment, and we'll touch upon what an EIA report should look like. In the following section on the 26th of February, we're going to be kind of covering off this bottom half of this process. So hence why we've just brought this in. But for you guys as planning officers, it's very much going to be in this scoping area of activity that we focus. One of the key things for scoping that is particularly important for us is if we can get it right, if we can, in our first stab or in our engagement pre-application, get the developer's assessment focused on the key issues, get them to gather the right information, have them present it in an effective manner, then we can avoid at this later stage, once we've examined the application and it's EIA reports, the consultation responses, we can hopefully avoid the need for supplementary information requests. Because if we make those requests, you can see we end up kind of a bit snakes and ladders, hitting a snake and going all the way back and having to do a lot more work, which is a lot more delay, more resources for yourselves to handle that additional documentation coming in. So we're trying to be efficient in scoping, but we're trying to be effective as well. We want to try and deal with it in a way that helps minimize our resources and maximize, flow through of key information from the statutory consultees, but we need to give opinion from ourselves and be effective so that we hopefully avoid supplementary information requests. Just to be clear, however, anything that we actually state at scoping in our scoping opinions as a planning authority does not limit you as planning officers at a later stage from bringing up issues. So if something you weren't aware of becomes an issue later on in terms of an issue that environmental issue that could be significant, then you still do retain this power, even if there has been a scoping opinion. So why is it important to getting it right? Well, I've already alluded to this on the previous diagram, but I guess what's really important to highlight is, unlike screening, and I suppose in webinar 3 and what we'll talk about on the 26th of February in terms of actually the process between application and consent decision, scoping is much more about effectiveness of the process, getting the right information in, rather than kind of formal decisions that can have some implications or potentially lead to judicial review. Scoping is about shaping that information early on in the process. It's intended to influence the development's assessment work, but hopefully increasingly also influence the development's design work so that they're hopefully designing out negative effects or building in opportunities for positive. But it is meant to focus us onto those significant issues. And then there, of course, is a formal process within the regulations in relation to scoping. And some of you might have been scratching your head thinking, why hasn't he mentioned this already? So there is the opportunity for developers to make a scoping request, and that would trigger a formal process from yourselves in terms of issuing a scoping opinion. And we will, of course, go on and talk about that. And in fact, the difference between, I suppose, the practice of scoping and the formal regulatory procedures is what we'll go on to in these next coming slides. So, what's the difference between scoping practice and the regulatory process of a request from the developer and an opinion from yourselves as a planning authority? Well, the key message, I guess, is that scoping is a process. It is how we focus, how we determine what is the most relevant information, what are the significant effects, and how we bring that forward ultimately in an effective narrative to go alongside the application process. So that process is led by the developer because ultimately it's all channeling to their EIA report. So in practice, it's very much developer-led is scoping. They are the ones who have to produce an EIA report. They're the ones who have to work out what information to include in that, what are the significant issues, and of course they therefore bring consultants and competent experts in to do that work. And they should be building that into their design process, as I say, to apply the mitigation hierarchy and try and avoid, prevent, reduce, or ultimately if they need to compensate for adverse effects. So practice, the delivery of an effective EIA report and the scoping of that is with the developers, but there is a voluntary process that's set out in the regulations, and this is at the developer's discretion. But if they choose to, they can make a scoping request to yourselves, and that's an ability set out within the EIA regulations. And if they do make that request to yourselves as a planning authority, then it triggers a formal process, and that is the need to produce an EIA scoping opinion. So I'll briefly cover practice and a little bit more on that before we focus really in on the task that you guys would be more commonly involved with. So in terms of the practice side, led by the developer and their consultants, it doesn't mean that you guys won't be involved, but once it's clear that an EIA development is needed, so perhaps it's gone through the screening process and you guys have issued a screening opinion saying EIA is required, or it might be the developer has already identified and volunteered to do an EIA report, then they'll be using competent experts to produce their EIA report, and that'll be a group of consultants, and they'll be coordinating the EIA process and have water, ecology, landscape, etc. experts within that process. And beyond issuing a scoping request, if they choose to do so, they're clearly going to be involved in the design team, the application team for the developer. So there's going to be a number of different things going on. Clearly, pre-application engagement is going to be going on. Within the wider planning system, there are requirements for that, and therefore the developers team might get in touch with you, directly with the consultation bodies, even out to public workshops and those type of things to talk about the developments, understand views, but also within that understand environmental issues, data and availability of information. So various different activities can go on here, and of course there are professional body guides and sector guidance that is available to help shape the direction of that process. So all of this going on as part of the pre-application process for the developer, but they do have this tool within the regulations that they can trigger if they choose, which is the formal scoping request. So let's look at that and let's spend some time in terms of what that process is, and then going on to the activities that you guys will undertake if required to. So scoping within the EIA regulations, so the regulatory component of scoping, I suppose as a stage rather than its wider process, set out under Part 4 of our EIA regs, those being Town and Country Planning Scotland 2017, and that Part 4 talks about the preparation of EIA reports. So that is what scoping is directing us towards, and it's actually under Regulation 17 that sets out the formal procedures for this. So what's in there? Well, the developer has the opportunity to make a scoping request, but it's voluntary. The words in the regulation, as you can see there under 17.4, 5 or 6, is may request. But if they do make such a request, so if it comes to you, even though for them it's voluntary, once it arrives with you as a planning authority, it is triggering a formal response. And those regs that I referenced, 17.4, 5 and 6, they set out what your formal requirements are. So you guys are required to consult with the statutory consultees. They're defined under Regulation 2, and there's others as well. Take into account the information that the developer has provided. Ultimately produce a scoping opinion. You have 35 days for that, but we'll come back to timings a little bit later. And then you need to make that opinion available. So just before we get into your activities and digging into each of those areas a little bit further, what does the developer have to send in to enable you guys to make your scoping opinion? Well, a little bit like screening, there are expectations as to what, within the legislation, within the regulations, as to what a developer must submit. What I should highlight, though, is the description, these requirements for scoping haven't actually changed since the 1999 EIA regulations. So they're quite basic. You can see them on the screen there. Description of the location of development, including a plan sufficient to identify the land, brief description of the nature and purpose of the development, and some linkage to what the developer and their consultants feel are likely to be the significant environmental effects, and then effectively abroad and anything else the developer fancies sending you, the informational representatives as they wish to provide. So there's actually far less detail that is required by a scoping request than there is in the previous screening request. However, what is far more likely to happen in practice is you will actually receive a scoping report from the developer or their consultants as part of this request. And that can, in some cases, be quite a lengthy document with a degree of analysis and data gathering already undertaken. So one thing you've got to do when you do get this request in is just make sure that it has sufficient information to be classed as a screening request and to enable you guys to undertake a scoping opinion. You've got 21 days to make that judgment. However, that isn't a different clock to the 35 days to make your opinion. So don't be sitting on it and thinking, oh, we've got late ages. You do need to be cracking on and looking at these things. But as you can see, there's quite limited expectations in the regulations, so that sufficient information might be a bit of a challenge to go back on, particularly if a quite long scoping report has been submitted to you. So what are your activities? What do you guys need to do? You've received this scoping request from the developer or their consultants. You've had a look at it and you deem that it covers the requirements it needs to cover. Well, there's three key activities that need to be done. The first, as we can see here, is seek information. then form the opinion, and then communicate the opinion. So that first activity is to seek information, and that is a requirement that you guys as the planning authority must undertake certain consultations. Now, to be clear, this is not a public consultation period. This is a effectively kind of public body, consultation body consultation at this stage. So you're required to consult the consultation bodies as defined by the EIA regulations, and that's in Regulation 2. So those are your adjoining planning authorities, and that's Nature Scot, SEPA, Historic Environment Scotland, and Scottish Water. So those of them you have to consult. Then, if you feel they're relevant, and this is a judgment that you've got to look at, you've read the scoping request, you've seen the developments, you've got to make a judgment. Do you also want to include the Health and Safety Exec, the Office of Nuclear Regulation, or any other public body that you're aware of that you think might be interested due to either their specific environmental responsibilities or their local or regional understanding competencies that may be relevant? So there is a little bit of thinking needed to be there. The must-dos in that first bullet, the consultation bodies, and then are we going to invite additional people into that in relation to this development and its environmental risks? So that's our first activity. Our second activity, but this starts, frankly, alongside the first activity. So we want to get that consultation done, that first activity, very quickly, because we want to give the maximum opportunity for the consultation bodies to respond. But ultimately, it is ourselves as the planning authority who have to produce a scoping opinion. So it is our opinion that needs to be produced, drawing on responses from the consultees should we get any. So what do we need to do to form a scoping opinion? Well, as a planning authority, so as the planning officer looking at this, you need to take account of the information provided by the developer. That could be quite light in terms of just the characteristics of the development, its location, its kind of size, and its likely effects on the environment, or it could be quite a long and detailed document, as I mentioned, in terms of a scoping report. So the scale of that task of taking in that information may be quite different. In addition to that, the regulations require you to take account of any responses that you receive from those who you've consulted under Activity 1, and also a good thing that you should do is gain those views of any internal consultees. Whilst you are the planning authority, you're also the local authority, the council, and there could be staff outside of the core planning team who may also have perspectives. So there is that internal kind of consideration to take into account to form the planning authority's opinion. And ultimately, you need to produce your opinion and your expectations in terms of the scope and level of detail of the developer's EIA report. It's very easy to kind of get bounced along by what the developer's saying, or simply throw in everything the statutory consultees say. But we do, and as we'll see later when we talk about some of the hints and tips, we do need to make sure it is our opinion, or there's some of our opinion in there. And then finally, our third activity, we've done the consultation, we've made our scoping opinion, which involves judgment and ultimately some writing up. We need to then communicate that opinion, and the regulations obviously set out this requirement. It needs to be sent back to the developer, but also don't forget, as we talked about in screening last time, there is this Regulation 28 sat much deeper into the legislation, which is about the availability of all our opinions for inspection. So we need to make our scoping opinion available for inspection on the website and also accessible on the register all reasonable hours, and retain it for at least 2 years. So that's likely to be put on your online systems, but that might not be you responsible for that. So making sure that has happened is important. It is part of the regulatory duties. So let's go on to just quickly look at those timings, and then also look at something that sits slightly separate in the regulations, but is all part of this preparing for the EIA report, and therefore often ends up kind of mixed in with the scoping process, but technically is a separate regulatory aspect. So first, let's look at those timings in relation to this formal process once we get a request in. So once the request comes in, we have 21 days within which time we can say, we don't think this is actually sufficient to make a scoping, to enable us to make a scoping opinion based on this request. If that's the case, we need to go back to the developer and notify them of this, and obviously be clear as to what additional information we would need. But that 21 days starts running from when we receive the request. At the same time, the same clock is running for the 35 days to as the kind of standard time expected for a planning authority to adopt its scoping opinion and issue it to the developer. So it isn't like we can have 21 days and then start our 35-day clock. They are both started at the same time. So hence that first activity of checking, do we think there's enough information here for us to move our opinion forward? Have they covered the basics of what a scoping request should cover? We want to try and get that done as early as possible. Now, there's 35 days to issue the scoping opinion, effectively five weeks. It's going to be a challenge. I'm not going to lie about that. It's going to be a challenge for any planning authority, particularly if you weren't necessarily expecting and hadn't been kind of highlighted as to when the request was going to come in by the developer. It's going to be a challenge to get that out within 5 weeks. If you want to and feel you need to extend it beyond 35 days, then it can be a longer period than 35 days, but you're expected to agree with this with the developer. So ultimately, the developer might not be particularly happy about it, but they are more likely to agree because they want your opinion. However, they're of course not just sat on their hands doing nothing. The design is advancing, their consultants will still be working. So the sooner we can get an opinion to them, the more influence we have on the process. So we're aiming for 35 days. If it's looking like it's going to be over, don't leave that to day 35 to get in touch with the developer. Clearly seek to agree that. But obviously when we have that longer period agreed, then we need to be making sure we're hitting it. So after 35 days, or the agreed longer period, the developer does have the option to request that the Scottish ministers instead produce a scoping direction. So the Scottish government scopes what should be in the EIA report rather than you as the planning authority. Now, this isn't a power that's used particularly often. I'll talk about it a little bit more in some later slides. And that's obviously because you guys are still going to be the consenting authority. So there's a real desire from clearly from the developer and their consultants to understand your opinions rather than getting the views from Scottish ministers. And just once you have produced the opinion, there's a minimum time that it remains available to the public in terms of on the register and the website, which is 2 years. Obviously, you guys aren't going to be kind of checking that in every case, and likely on the website it's going to retain for much longer, but just be aware of that kind of expectation. I guess if there are, we're doing an update of our register and changing things on our website or whatever. So thinking about timings still, when can the developer make their scoping request? Well, the most obvious time is pre-application, because that's when they're going to be looking to bring the application forward, and clearly their EIA report as well. In that pre-application period, they can jointly request screening and scoping together. You might remember, if you were involved in listening to the last webinar, me talking about this from the screening perspective, but effectively they're saying, is an EIA required? And if it is found to be required, please can you immediately go on to tell me what I should include in this, what your opinion is. So you deal with the screening first, and then if identified that EIA is needed, the day you issue the screening opinion is the day you effectively consider you had the request for scoping, and the 35-day clock starts. Now, there is a possibility, if we haven't identified the need for EIA before the application comes in, you'll recall from the last webinar, then there is obviously a need to check if EIA is needed. And if at that stage we've got an application in and we identify its EIA development, then of course that application can't progress. And there is the opportunity still for the developer to seek a scoping opinion to inform their EIA reports to enable them to then add that to their application. In theory, it's also worth noting, right at the back of Regulation 17 that covers scoping, 1712, a later scoping opinion supersedes the terms of an earlier scoping opinion. So it's clearly understood within the legislative basis that there can be multiple scoping opinions for a single development from a planning authority. Now, How this occurs isn't really necessarily clarified in the regulations, but that text is there. So we could have multiple scoping opinions. That could be multiple requests from a developer, or perhaps the proposal significantly changed, maybe a considerable amount of time has passed. So that's something just to be aware of. Just beyond scoping itself, but within this kind of preparation of the EIA report stage, there's Regulation 19, and this isn't something that gets talked about a lot in terms of EIA, but I just wanted to flag it to you guys. So this is the ability of the developer to engage with yourselves and the consultation bodies in relation to yourselves or the consultation bodies providing environmental information or data that you have that would be relevant to the developer or their consultant's EIA work. So effectively under this regulation, under a Regulation 19 process, the developer can inform you as the planning authority that they intend to submit an EIA report, and that should again trigger a formal process. You notify the consultation bodies and any of those other public bodies you found relevant, and the developer of each other's contact details so that they can get in touch with each other. And then there's a duty to engage and identify relevant information if the developer follows up to say, please, can you tell me if you've got any information on this site or this river or whatever else it might be. Usually that's all wrapped up in the scoping process, or it might have even been taken care of in terms of pre-application engagement from the consultants. But I just wanted to flag that it sits there and it is a regulatory process a developer could choose to use. So if you get a request in saying, we're doing an EIA report, please can you provide us with environmental information and data, be aware what they're effectively highlighting is Reg 19, and there are some expectations on you. You are able to make a reasonable charge in relation to that, and the environmental information regs do apply to that request. So what are you guys doing with a scoping opinion? Well, that partly depends on what the developer is actually asking, or kind of where they've got to in their design process when they when they make their scoping request. So I've tried to break this down into, I suppose, 3 different kind of possibilities, but clearly, as we'll see at the end of this slide, there's a spectrum for this. So they could be very, very early in their process, getting in touch with you to kind of say, what might be relevant? We haven't really thought about this. What might be relevant to our EIA? This could be very early in the design process. Perhaps they haven't brought their consultants on board. It could be more in the middle of the process. What should be in the EIA report? What should we focus on? They've probably gathered quite a bit of information already, but they're now asking for you guys to give an oversight of it, allow the consultees to give an oversight of it, and give some indication as to where the priorities might be. Are there gaps? Are there areas where they're perhaps covering things that don't need to be in as much detail? Or finally, they could be far, far more advanced, and they could have really locked into what the final design is. And what they could be trying to do is really confirm, this is what we're planning to do. This is the work we've already done. Do you agree that there's nothing missing, so that when we get to the EIA report, we're both on, pretty good terms in terms of kind of common understanding of what should be there. This means you're probably going to get a very long scoping report, and it can be a little bit more challenging to kind of keep with that focus of this is the planning authority's scoping opinion, rather than just simply going, we agree with what has been presented by the developers. But effectively, there is a scoping spectrum of what might be being asked. And I guess quite early on, when you read through the documentation, you need to be kind of getting a bit of a concept as to where you sit within that. And if we think about that proportionate EIA, the proportionate scope, the effective EIA report we want to see with the application, how this scoping spectrum links to that, we're bringing this diagram that hopefully will be in a future document from the Northern Irish government in terms of EIA and scoping guidance, but it is still forthcoming. But what this highlights is if we have an inadequate scope, we haven't covered enough things, then the negative consequences can be there's clearly gaps, and we'll have to fill those later on. That's a risk of delay, more resources for yourselves, the consultation bodies. But if we disproportionately scope things, if we've included too much already, then that excess content can equally mask the findings, cause difficulties for yourselves, the consultation bodies, the public at a later stage. So what we're trying to get to is a more proportionally scoped assessment. Key environmental information is easily identifiable and accessible to you guys for decision making. We know what are the more priority areas, either in terms of overall environmental topics or in terms of sub-issues, and any areas that need filling in. So what do we want to include in this opinion that we are issuing? Well, as a minimum, your views as the planning officer, or representing your planning authority, taking in, if you still happen to have the benefit of an ecologist or cultural heritage specialists within the council or other consultees. What do we expect the EIA report to be covering? And what do I mean by that? Well, what do we feel are the significant issues? What are the methods and data sources that we might be expecting, or the particular receptors we might be expecting to hear about? Are there gaps or are there uncertainties within the information that's been presented as to what they're planning to do in order to help them focus their work? Advice: we want to draw across the evidence that's being provided. Avoid a big long list of "we agree" or "we generally agree with the methods that you've set out." The consultants want to know, what is your perspective? So if they are on the right track, that's great, but try and highlight that as the perspective from the planning authority, simply rather than simply saying, we agree with chapter 4, we agree with chapter 5 of the scoping report, etc. Be clear in terms of landscape visual assessment. We feel the right methods have been identified and the receptors that have been identified are suitable. We have some concerns that there perhaps additional receptors might be needed here, here, and here, or whatever it is. So your opinion is important. And then the other thing we want to do is, if we have heard back from the statutory consultees and others that we've consulted, what are their key messages? But we want to summarize those in our opinion. We don't want to just take vast amounts of their text and kind of slot those in and effectively be, here are 2 pages from SEPA, then there's a page from Historic Environment Scotland, then there's Scottish Water, etc. We still need the planning authority opinion within that. So we can do a little bit of cut and pasting, but make sure it's your own opinion. And clearly, alongside that, we can appendix and put in the full consultation responses, or set them forward. Also useful to advise the developer to follow up with consultees if a particular consultee hasn't responded or if they haven't been entirely clear. That isn't your job at that stage. You've done your job in scoping. You consulted them, they came back or they didn't. If they haven't come back, but they're going to be involved in the later process, then it isn't your job to make that happen. Clearly, you can chase them a bit, but the developer ultimately is producing their EIA report at their risk. So highlighting SEPA unfortunately didn't get back, therefore you might well want to follow up with them to understand their opinions. You've then passed that on. Should SEPA the day after then send you content, obviously feel free to send that on to the developer, but you don't have to retain that responsibility for the whole kind of process. It's the developer's EIA report. Just a little bit about challenge to scoping opinions. It's not the same as we were talking last time in relation to screening. So it's a very different message here. We're not looking at kind of avoiding judicial review or that type of thing, because screening is part of an ongoing process. We've got the submission, we've got consultation, we examine the EIA report and the consultation responses, we have our further information powers before we even get to consent. So we've got a whole load of stages before this. So scoping is really about kind of effective practice. So you won't see as many developer requests for scoping directions as you would see perhaps for screening, and there's no kind of third-party right of challenge to a scoping opinion. Obviously, the public get an opportunity to look at the EIA report and application later, so that's where they get their voice. So the request is voluntary. The PA's opinion, your opinion in terms of scoping opinion, it's not binding. The EIA report needs to be based on the scoping opinion, but that's quite weak wording for legislation. It could have said, must follow the scoping opinion or various other things. So it does give room for evolution of design, findings coming out from the work that you've suggested to allow the EIA report to evolve. Of course, you'd want the developer to describe that in that later work, but you also, as I mentioned earlier, retain that right to seek additional information information, supplementary information requests later in the process. And as indicated, there's no direct legal challenge to a scoping opinion. That's not possible. Any challenge would need to come to an awarded consent at a later stage. So, and then ultimately that would be looking more at the EIA procedural failings rather than just the scoping process. So that's why the ability to go to the Scottish ministers for scoping direction isn't as commonly used as might be seen for other areas. So let's just quickly go through the guidance that's available and then focus on some hints and tips. So very similar to last time in terms of our government guidance, the circular from 2017 in relation to the 2017 regs, and PAN 1 2013 still having some useful advice in relation to scoping. And then of course, scoping is mentioned across Historic Environment Scotland and Nature Scott's EIA Handbook 3rd edition, so that's always useful to reference. In particular, in relation to onshore wind developments, there are 2 Nature Scott guides in relation to cumulative landscape and visual impacts for onshore wind, and also in terms of birds and onshore wind development. So those can be useful in terms of if you have an onshore development and onshore wind development, and those issues are going to be scoped in, the methodologies within them and expectations can be useful. But I am aware that obviously some planning authorities also have their own guidance for some of these areas or own expectations because they've had quite a number of developments. There is quite a lot of professional body guidance on different topics in relation to EIA that can be useful to refer to, or you may have referred to you in a scoping report from the developers' consultants. So there's a huge catalogue of guidance from ICEP, the Institute for Sustainability and Environmental Professionals, greenhouse gas, climate change adaptation, environmental noise, health, material assets, etc., use of mitigation hierarchy, how to take into account major accident disasters requirements, etc. So that is behind, or the majority of that, I'm afraid, is behind IEMA's paywall. However, if you've got any memberships within your planning authority, you can get access to that, and that can be quite useful to be aware of. The Greenhouse Gas Guide is going through an update at the moment, so there will shortly be some supplementary guidance to the version 2 of that. And then there's a number of other body guides. For ecological assessment, it tends to follow CIEM's, the Chartered Institute for Ecology and Environmental Management's ecological impact assessment guidance. And then landscape and visual, heritage tend to follow these kind of joint guidances produced by ICEP as it is now, and a number of other bodies. So you may well see reference to these, or if you don't, you might want to reference these in terms of kind of core methodologies to be used. Let's go on to some hints and tips now, some do's and don'ts. So let's initially look at what makes scoping, or what could make scoping less effective in terms of practice. So if in our opinion, or in the work that the consultants have done, any of the parties involved are being really risk averse, then of course we can end up carrying too much information, gathering too much information. Now clearly there's a balance here. We can't just, be gung-ho about things, but it does mean that we can think about reducing some content, or not everything needing to be the same level of detail. And I guess also if we have a very long scoping report that comes in from a consultant, don't just focus on, oh, there's a gap there, oh, that might not be filled in the same amount of detail as these bits, and kind of find yourself gap filling and going down that line. Think also, there might be some fat here that needs to be trimmed. So be open-minded in your approach. When you're writing the scoping opinion, if there's a lack of actual planning authority opinion, that can be a difficulty. Or if the content is simply led by cutting and pasting from the consultation bodies, then again, is that really giving your opinion? Ultimately, you're going to have to make those judgments later once you've got the application. So the more we can have some understanding of that now is important for the developer and their consultants. Poor use of language, particularly vague language. We generally agree with your methodology. We generally agree with the viewpoints you've identified. Do you agree or do you not agree? Some clarity of that is useful. And then the communication, avoid undue delay. If you can hit the 35 days, that's great. If it's a longer period you've agreed, fine. But if you're waiting for that last statutory consultee to come back, and that's another 2 weeks that you end up waiting, and perhaps they still don't come back, that's 2 weeks when all the information that you've already put together in the opinion, all the other information from the other environmental bodies hasn't been with the consultant and therefore hasn't had the opportunity to influence people. Oh, and yes, just to mention, there's nothing actually in the regulations themselves that requires those statutory consultees to respond to you guys. So, check up with them, see if they're going to respond, but there's nothing that is going to mandate them through the EIA regs to respond. You're required to consult them. In terms of what should we do? Well, for your thinking for effective scoping, think about scoping topics down. It can be very difficult to fully remove a topic, or if we are doing that, it's still going to need to be explained why it's been removed in the EIA report and some evidence to justify that. But we can think about how we scope down topics. How can we focus those topics in a little bit more? So not every chapter, not every sub-issue will need to be assessed in the same level of detail. We want to focus on the significant effects, or if we don't know whether an issue is significant at the scoping phase, where are the uncertainties that we might want filling, rather than just asking for more and more and more. We can try and anticipate issues if there are those uncertainties that we can see we've got some questions about. Try and highlight those now rather than hoping they go away and then finding they're the same when you get the EIA report in and ultimately needing a supplementary information request. We could have dealt with it earlier. And just think maybe, about having, even just in your notebook, a bit of a storyboard of, what are the key issues for this project in terms of the environment? Who are the key parties involved? What are your key thoughts? So that you've got that to refer back to when you're coming to write the opinion and equally when the application comes in later. And then letting the developer and the consultants know your key information needs from the EIA report. This is an important area that I think isn't done really enough by a lot of planning authorities. How do you want scoping issues or gaps that you've highlighted in your scoping opinion to be addressed in the EIA report? You can say, we'd like a table before the topic chapters that clearly indicates where the issues we've raised and the statutory consultees raised have been addressed, where they haven't been addressed, where we can find them in this document. Good practice consultants will already do that, but you can ask for that. You could ask for a one-page kind of key findings at the start of each of those topic factors that sets out this chapter concludes no significant effects, or this chapter concludes these 3 significant effects, and here's the key mitigation, so that you can look at each of those pages and get an understanding as to how much time, when that later document comes in, how much time you need to spend on them. And equally, what do you want to see in relation to those EIA reports, conversations across the planning officers with EIA experience, what is good, what is helpful, and having in some standard expectations can be very useful. So what happens after that scoping opinion has been issued? What's happening from the developer viewpoint moving forward? Well, effectively what we get is the developer then moves on or continues their assessment, or their consultants do. So the consultants are going to undertake baseline information gathering, analysing trends, understanding sites, doing monitoring of future baseline, getting out into the environment and doing some new surveys. They're going to be doing an assessment where they're identifying direct and indirect impacts from construction, operation, maybe even decommissioning activities. What is the development going to do at different stages? Where are the risks of consequence to the environment in terms of effects, and understanding those descriptors? And then ultimately, are those being judged as significant? They're going to feed that into the iteration of the project design, hopefully, because that's kind of one of the other purposes of EIA, is to influence for better applications, better developments. They're going to reassess where the design has changed or where mitigation has been put forward and accepted by the developer. What was the significance? And now what is the significance after that mitigation, and is there uncertainty? And then ultimately all of that written up in an EIA report. Now next time we'll give some consideration to what's in an EIA report, because you have to check that these have been met as part of the submission process. But just to highlight, the EIA report that the developer is writing up, scoping's done, the assessment's done, the report they're producing, they need to explain what the development is, what its significant effects are, the design features and mitigation measures. If they did consider alternatives as an applicant, how did that go? and what were the main reasons for choosing the application that's come forward. There's a non-technical summary, and then there's reference to Schedule 4, which has a lot more detail on kind of filling out all of those different areas. So there are things that are already required in the application document that unfortunately are also required in the EIA report, which does mean it is going to be perhaps longer than it could be if we cut it down to absolute bare essentials, but it doesn't have to necessarily be quite the behemoth that we see coming in at the moment. And that leads us to this concept of proportionate EIA. And these are my last few slides before we get to the learning review and move on to the Q&A. But since 2017, when I was still at EIA, as it was at the time, now ICEP, we came up through 2016 with a summit and discussions and workshops across the country. And then we came up in 2017 in the summer with this delivering proportionate EIA. How do we move forward collaboratively, planning authorities, statutory consultees, developers, consultants, government, to make EIA more effective, more focused, EIA that delivers valuable and accessible information, positively influencing development design and the consenting process to the benefit of developers, communities and the environment. And we identified these different action areas. I won't talk a huge amount about this here, but improving scoping, enhancing people, as in capacity building, training, etc. Very much what we've been doing in today's session is very much about, achieving some of these goals. And in Scotland, we've actually seen some great work in the last couple of years to push this forward. So as part of the onshore wind sector deal, one of the expectations was how do we make more proportionate EIA reports? And Scottish Renewables, as an outcome of that sector deal, produced these guidelines for streamlining EIA for onshore wind farms in September last year. And much of this, even though it's about streamlining EIA reports, is actually about making the scoping process more effective. So you can see the quotes there, using the EIA scoping process to focus on the real potential for significant effects, taking account of 30 years of experience in Scotland, recommended that more efficient and effective scoping consultation used to ensure reports are not drafted in this over precautionary manner and that they do focus on significant effects. Clearly, if you're not working on offshore wind farms, then that guide isn't directly relevant to you. But at the Scotland's conference on EIA in both 2024 and last year in 2025, we had some discussions about how can we mainstream the ideas from this into other sectors where EIA is required. And it'd be a great area, I think, for yourselves as planning authorities and maybe getting the statutory consultees in on the action if there is some further National Planning Hub work around EIA kind of after March this year. Maybe this is an area to kind of focus on. How do we take the learning from that, take the process that was behind that? It involved the government, it involved lawyers, it involved consultants, it involved planning authorities, statutory consultees. How could we do a similar thing to give some overarching advice? So just to close out today before we go to the Q&A, hopefully you feel that you've upped your understanding of what the role of scoping is and how it helps deliver a more proportionate, more effective, more high quality application from the developer. Hopefully you recognise those duties and effective practices around the scoping request and then what you guys need to do as a planning authority with a scoping opinion, and also how that opinion links into the later stages. And of course, we've been through a number of tips, advice and highlighted guidance. So before we go to the Q&A, just to highlight, if you want to register, I believe all of these are now available online. If they are not, then they will be shortly and through the National Planning Hub's website, the events page. 2 weeks' time, we're back talking about what happens between the submission of an application and the consent decision in terms of EIA activities for you as a planning officer. 12th of March, we're going to look at EIA and wider linkages, so Section 42 applications, other EIA regs, how EIA links to other assessments. And then on the 26th of March, so a month, about 6 weeks away, we're going to be talking Rochdale envelope, so EIA and design parameters, cumulative effects in kind of the first half, and Neil Collar and myself will be doing that, and then we'll do a course summary and a Q&A in relation to that.